the lights and grab some popcorn because here we have the top 10 scariest scary stories to tell in the dark. Number 10. The Red Spot. The Red Spot is a short scary story about a young girl who wakes up one morning with a strange blemish on her face. It is based on an urban legend called the spider bite or spiders in the cheek. A version of this story appeared in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. One night, a young girl was sleeping in her bed when a spider crawled across her face. It stopped for a few minutes on her left cheek, then it went on its way. When she woke up the next morning and looked in the mirror, she noticed a red spot on her cheek. "What's this?" she asked her mother. "It looks like a spider bite," her mother replied. "It will go away, just don't scratch it." Soon the small red spot grew into a big red boil. "Look at it now," the girl said. "It's getting bigger." "That sometimes happens," her mother said. "It's coming to a head." In a few days the red spot was even larger. "Look at it now," the girl said. "It hurts so much and it makes me look so ugly." "We'll have the doctor look at it," her mother said. "Maybe it's infected." But the doctor couldn't see the girl until the next day. That night she decided to take a nice, relaxing bath. As she lay soaking in the warm water, the boil suddenly burst. Out poured a swarm of tiny spiders from the eggs their mother had laid in her cheek. Number 9. Me Tai Do Tai Walker. Me Tai Do Tai Walker is a scary story for kids. It is based on an old traditional tale from American folklore. A different version of this story appeared in the Alvin Schwartz book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There was a small village in the middle of a dark forest. In the village, there was a haunted house that everyone was terrified to enter. Nobody would dare to stay there overnight. Legend had it that, every night at midnight, a bloody severed head fell down the chimney. One day, a rich man was passing through the village. After hearing about the haunted house, he offered $1,000 to whoever was brave enough to spend an entire night inside. None of the villagers would take him up on his bet until a young boy stepped forward and raised his hand. The boy announced that he would spend the night in the haunted house as long as he could bring his dog with him. The man agreed and it was settled. The next evening, the boy set off for the haunted house, with his trusty dog following close behind. As he entered the dreary abode, he whistled a happy tune to calm his nerves. After doing a little exploring, he decided to make himself comfortable in the living room. He started a fire in the fireplace, then lay down on the couch with his dog and waited for morning to arrive. For a while, nothing happened. Then, a little after midnight, he thought he heard a strange noise over the cracking of the fire and the creaking of the house. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere out in the woods. Someone or something was singing a haunting tunes. "Me Tai Do Tai Walker," sang the eerie voice. The boy stared out the window and his hair stood on end. "Maybe it's just somebody taking a shortcut through the woods," he told himself. Then, his dog suddenly perked up and sang, "Linky Kinchi Kali Molly Dingo Dingo." The boy could hardly believe his ears. His dog had never uttered a word before. Now it was answering the haunting voice in the woods. He pinched himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. A few minutes later, the boy heard the voice singing again, only this time it was closer and louder. "Me Tai Do Tai Walker," sang the mysterious voice. The dog answered again, "Linky Kinchi Kali Molly Dingo Dingo." This really had the boy scared. He was afraid that whoever was lurking in the woods would hear the dog singing and come to get them. A few minutes later, the boy heard the voice singing again. Now it was in the backyard. "Me Tai Do Tai Walker," it cried. The dog sang back louder, "Linky Kinchi Kali Molly Dingo Dingo." A few minutes later, the boy heard the voice singing again. Now it was coming down the chimney. "Me Tai Do Tai Walker," it yelled. Again, the dog sang back, "Linky Kinchi Kali Molly, dingo, dingo. Suddenly a bloody severed head fell down the chimney. It missed the fire and landed right in front of the dog. The dog took one look at it and fell over dead from fright. Then, the head turned and stared at the boy. It slowly opened its mouth and screamed. The next morning, the rich man went to check on the boy. He found him lying on the floor of the haunted house. His hair had turned white and he couldn't stop screaming. Number 8. Cold as Clay. Cold as Clay is a scary story for kids about a young girl whose father refuses to allow her to marry her lover. This tale is also sometimes known as the Ghost Rider and the Holland Handkerchief. It is based on a 17th century English ballad called The Suffolk Miracle. A version of this story appeared in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There was a wealthy farmer who had a beautiful young daughter. He cared for her more than anything on earth and called her his heart's delight. Many young men came to visit her and asked for her hand in marriage, but she wasn't interested in any of them. Then, one day, she met a boy who worked in the stables and she fell in love with him. The boy came from a poor family and the farmer did not think he was a good enough match for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent the girl to live with her uncle who had a farm 50 miles away. After the girl left, the boy fell into a deep depression. Trying to forget about his lost love, he took a job as a sailor and went away to sea. On the voyage, the young man got sick and gradually wasted away. When he died, everyone said it was of a broken heart. When the farmer learned of the poor boy's fate, he felt so guilty that he could not bring himself to tell his daughter the terrible news. Unaware of her lover's sad end, the girl continued to dream about the bright future they would someday spend together. A year passed and, one dark night, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, she found her lover standing there, holding the reins of a pale white horse. "Your father asked me to come get you," he said. "Is there anything wrong?" asked the girl. "You'll see when we get there," he replied. She quickly packed some clothes and together, they rode off into the night. She sat behind him on the horse, her arms clutched tightly around his waist. "The moon is bright and death is riding with us," he said. "Are you not afraid?" "I am not afraid because I am with you," she replied. The boy complained of a headache. She put her hand on his forehead. "You're as cold as clay," she said. "I hope you are not ill." The girl tied her handkerchief around his head. They rode through the night and, before long, they reached the farm. The girl quickly got down from the horse and knocked on the door. "Who's there?" her father demanded. "It's your daughter," she replied. "Didn't you send for me?" "No, I certainly did not," said her father. She turned to her lover, but he was gone and so was the horse. They went into the stables and found the horse in a cold sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of the boy. Terrified, her father finally broke down and told her the truth about her boyfriend's death. They went to see Jim's parents and decided to open his grave. When they lifted the lid of the coffin and peered in at the corpse, they saw that, tied around his head, was the girl's handkerchief. Number 7. Harold. The Scarecrow is a scary story about a farmer who builds the scariest and most hideous of all scarecrows to take care of his farm. There was an old farmer in Arizona who owned the best farm in the area. Everybody said his crops were the best and people came from all over to buy their goods from him. Whenever people asked him how he was able to grow such good quality crops, the old farmer would say it was all down to his scarecrow. "That old scarecrow is the one I have to thank," said the farmer. "He makes sure no crows or critters or pests come near my crops." The old farmer had built the scarecrow himself and it was a fearsome sight. He spent months working on it to make it as scary as possible. He knew how important it was to keep pests away from his crops. So he gave it enormous straw arms that stretched out about 6 feet and big long legs that made it as tall as a tree. But the scariest thing about this scarecrow was its head. The farmer carved it himself out of a huge pumpkin. He spent countless days and nights perfecting his design until it was perfect. The scarecrow's face and head was so grotesque and ugly that even he was sometimes scared to look at it. But it was very effective, scaring away every rodent and bird that ventured near. The neighboring farm was owned by 2 young men who were brothers, named Josh and Harold. They were lazy and never did much work around the farm, which resulted in their crops being bad. They were jealous of the old farmer's success and were plotting against him. If they could drive him out of business, they could take over his farm and make more money. So one night, the brothers decided to sneak onto the old farmer's land. They stole his prized scarecrow and brought it back to their own house, where they stuffed it into an old closet so nobody would ever find it. The next day, the farmer woke up to find his hideous scarecrow missing and all his crops being eaten by rats and crows. He fell to his knees and cried, knowing that his farm would soon be out of business. Meanwhile, the brothers, Josh and Harold, were watching from their own property and couldn't help laughing out loud when they saw the old man's tears of grief. Hearing the laughter, the old farmer came over and asked them if they knew what happened to his scarecrow. The brothers looked him right in the eye and said they had no idea where his precious scarecrow might be. "But you know I'll go out of business and have to sell my farm if I can't find my scarecrow," said the farmer. Josh just laughed in his face, saying, "That's just your tough luck, isn't it?" "Sucks to be you," giggled Harold. The old farmer walked slowly back to his house, his head hanging down in defeat and depression, that night, as Josh and Harold had trouble sleeping. Not because they felt any remorse, but because they couldn't get the image of the scarecrow's horrible twisted face out of their minds. They decided they would never be able to sleep as long as that ugly pumpkin head was in their house. So they got up and dragged the scarecrow out of the closet. Harold took a baseball bat and smashed the scarecrow's head to pieces until all that was left was little bits of pumpkin strewn around the floor. The brothers swept up the pumpkin head pieces and threw them in the trash. Then they went back to bed and were soon fast asleep, having put all thoughts of the disgusting scarecrow face out of their heads. Some time after midnight, Josh and Harold were awoken by the sounds of scratching and clawing at their bedroom door. "Did you forget to put the dog out?" asked Harold, sleepily. "We don't have a dog," stammered Josh. Suddenly the bedroom door burst open and a solitary, long straw arm snaked in through the opening. Then a second arm thrashed around, followed by 2 long stick legs. The 2 brothers were frozen in fear and could only look with horror as the headless scarecrow's body rose up on its long stick legs and its long arms reached out for them in the darkness. Harold felt a cold sinewy straw claw close around his ankle and screamed as loud as he could. He begged his brother Josh to help him. But Josh was already running out of the bedroom. Fleeing in terror, he ran down the hallway, crashed through the front door and out onto the moonlit road. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, puffing and panting and screaming at the top of his voice. As he passed his neighbor's house, he saw the old farmer standing at his gate. In the moonlight, he could see the farmer just staring at him with a strange smile on his face. Josh kept running, his bare feet slapping against the rough gravel road. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw something that scared him to his very soul. He saw the scarecrow running along the road close behind him. It was gaining on him, coming closer and closer. And that wasn't all he saw. He noticed that the scarecrow had a brand new head, and it looked a lot like Harold. Number 6. The Thing. The Thing is a scary story about 2 young boys who see something horrible in a cornfield at night. It is based on a Nova Scotian folk tale in the book Blue Nose Ghosts. A version of this story appeared in the book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There were two young boys named Trevor and Will. They spent most of their summer vacation hanging around town, looking for things to do. One hot August night, the boys were sitting on a fence by the main road. There was a cornfield just across the road. Suddenly, Trevor spotted something in the field. In the darkness, it was difficult to make out, but he thought it looked like some kind of weird animal. He nudged his friend and pointed in the direction of the strange-looking figure. Will said he could see it too. He wasn't sure, but mysterious things seemed vaguely human. The next thing they knew, the thing was gone. The boys craned their necks and scanned the field with their eyes. Out of the blackness came the thing. It slowly walked over to the edge of the field before disappearing again. Trevor and Will looked at each other, puzzled. "What was that?" asked Will. "I have no idea," replied Trevor. No sooner had he said that than Trevor felt a clammy hand on his shoulder. He turned around and found himself staring directly into the hideous face of the thing. He let out a yell of terror and surprise. The rotting skin on the thing's face was coming off in places, revealing the bone underneath. For a moment, it just stared silently at Trevor with its dark sunken eyes. Then, it suddenly grabbed hold of his arm. Trevor felt its fingernails dig into his flesh as he wriggled out of its grasp. The two boys leaped off the fence and ran down the road, screaming in horror. They didn't stop running until they reached their homes. They tried to tell their parents and friends about the thing they had seen that night, but nobody believed them. When Trevor woke up the next morning, the scratches on his arm were still there. After a few days, they got worse and worse. Trevor got sick and his parents took him to see a doctor. After examining his arm, the doctor told the boy it was infected and gave him some pills to take. Unfortunately, Trevor's condition got worse and worse. The infection spread to his entire arm and it wasn't long before his flesh was rotting and falling off. He was taken to hospital, but no matter what the doctors did, no treatment seemed to work. The infection spread throughout his whole body. Trevor was confined to bed and started to waste away. It seemed like he was beyond help, and as the days went by, he steadily grew worse and worse. His anguished parents could only sit at his bedside and cry as they watched their beloved son slowly rotting away before their eyes. On the day that Trevor finally passed away, Will came to the hospital to visit him. When the boy walked into the hospital room and saw Trevor lying in bed, he was horrified. His friend looked exactly like the thing. Number 5. The Dream. The Dream is a scary story for kids about a girl who has a nightmare in which she meets a creepy woman with black hair and black eyes. It is based on a tale recounted by Augustus Hare in his autobiography. A version of this story appeared in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Lexi Morgan had a dream. She was walking up a dark staircase, and when she got to the top, she walked into a bedroom. The bedroom carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors. And each of the windows was fastened shut with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lexi went to sleep in the bedroom, but during the night, a woman with a pale face, black eyes and long black hair slipped silently into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Run away while you still can." Then the black-haired woman grabbed her arm. Lexi Morgan woke up with a scream and lay awake the rest of the night, shivering and shaking with fear. In the morning she told her landlady that she had decided not to go to Kingston after all. "I can't tell you why," she said, "but I just can't bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?" the landlady asked. "It's a pretty town, and it isn't too far." So Lexi Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room in a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was nice as could be. "Let's look at the room," she said. "I think you will like it." They walked up a dark, carved staircase, like the one in Lexi's dream. In these old houses the staircases are all the same, Lexi thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors and the same windows fastened with big nails. This is just a coincidence, Lexi told herself. How do you like it? The landlady asked. I'm not sure, Lexi said. Well, take your time, the landlady said. I'll bring up some tea while you think about it. Lexi sat on the bed, staring at the trapdoors and the big nails. Soon there was a knock on the door. It's the landlady with tea, she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the woman with pale face and the black eyes and long black hair. Lexi Morgan grabbed her things and fled. Number 4. The Dare. There is a scary tale about a young girl whose bravery is put to the test when she accepts the challenge of sticking a knife in the grave of an old woman who is rumored to have been a witch. This story is also known as the girl who stood on the grave, the graveyard dare, and she's got me. Versions of the legend appeared in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, favorite scary stories of American children and short scary stories. One night, in a small American town, a young girl threw a party and invited all her friends from school. There was a large group of boys and girls, and as the night went on, they began telling scary stories. One boy said he had heard an urban legend about an old graveyard that was located near the girl's house. According to the story, an old woman had been buried in the middle of the cemetery and there were rumors that she was a witch. They said that if someone stood on her grave at midnight, she would grab them and drag them down to hell. I would never go near the graveyard after dark, another boy said. You're all a bunch of morons, laughed the girl who owned the house. It's just a silly superstition. I can't believe you'd take it seriously. The boy who had told the story turned to her and sneered. It's all very well to be brave when you're safe and warm in your own home. I think you'd have a different attitude if you actually went to that graveyard. It wouldn't make a difference, replied the girl haughtily. Okay, then prove it, said the boy. We'll all go down to the cemetery and wait outside while you go in and stand on the old witch's grave. A grave doesn't scare me, said the girl. I'll do it right now. You'll have to prove you really did it, said the boy. Otherwise you might chicken out. He took a knife from the kitchen drawer and handed it to her. Stick this knife in the grave, he said. Then we'll know you were there for sure. The group of kids set out for the graveyard, and when they reached the old iron gates, they gathered in a circle. All of them stared at the girl. She tried to pretend she wasn't scared, and she hoped they didn't see her shivering in fear. With the knife clutched tightly in her hand, the girl walked through the old iron gateway and made her way through the darkened graveyard. In the moonlight, the tombstones and the trees cast strange and unnerving shadows. Eventually, she came to the old woman's grave. There is nothing to be scared of, the girl told herself. It's just a stupid story. Crouching in front of the headstone, she whispered, I'm not afraid of you. Then she raised the knife above her head and thrust it into the earth. Take that, you old witch, she chuckled. The girl was about to turn and leave when she felt something holding her back. She couldn't move. Something was tugging on the hem of her dress and dragging her down. She was filled with terror and flew into a panic. Help! She cried. She's got me. She's got me. When she didn't come back, her friends began to get worried. After a while, they cautiously entered the graveyard to look for her. They found her sprawled across the old woman's grave. She was dead and her face was frozen in a silent scream. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and had pinned it to the ground. That was what had been holding her. The poor girl had been so terrified that her heart gave in and she died of fright. Number 3. One Sunday Morning. Sunday Morning is a scary story about a young girl who is always late for Mass at her church. It is based on an old French folk tale called the Spectre's Mass, which was first recorded in 1890. This is the same folk tale that inspired the story One Sunday Morning in the book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There was a young girl named Josephine who was habitually late for Sunday morning Mass at her local church. She always forgot to set her alarm and wouldn't wake up in time. Finally, she got tired of her parents telling her off and decided she would never be late for Mass again. One Sunday morning, Josephine woke up at midnight. Unaware of what time it was, she thought she had overslept again and jumped out of bed. She quickly got dressed and ran out the door without ever looking at the clock. It was still dark outside, but it usually was dark at that time of year. It was very quiet and there was nobody else on the street. The only sound she could hear was the noise of her own footsteps on the pavement as she hurried towards the church. When she heard the church bell ring, she quickened her pace and took a shortcut through the cemetery. She got to the church just as the service was about to begin. She found a seat and took a look around. Much to her surprise, she didn't recognize anyone. The church was filled with people she had never seen before. They were all staring straight ahead and an eerie silence hung over the gathering. When the priest came out to celebrate Mass, Josephine realized he was a stranger too. The priest told the congregation to pray for the soul of a young girl named Françoise who had died the night before. Josephine was shocked. She knew Françoise and she had never even heard that the poor girl was ill. Something was radically wrong. She began to feel very uneasy. She looked around again and, as her eyes began to adjust to the dim light, she saw someone she knew. There was an old woman sitting at the back of the church. Josephine's heart sank when she remembered the old woman had died the year before. Looking towards the front of the church, she saw that some of the people sitting there looked very strange. Their skin seemed to be pearly white. One of them turned his head and Josephine discovered to her horror that he was nothing but a skeleton in a suit. Just a skull and some bones. This is a mass for the dead, thought Josephine. Everybody here is dead, except me. It's a specter's mass. She noticed that some of them were staring at her. Their eyes were filled with anger. It was clear to her that she had no business being there. Suddenly, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Nervously, she turned around and found her grandfather standing in the row behind her. He had been dead for 3 years. There was a worried look on his face. He leaned towards her and whispered in her ear. "Leave right now, while you still can," he hissed. "You don't belong here." Josephine immediately grabbed her coat and walked quickly toward the door. She heard hollow footsteps echoing behind her and glanced back. The dead were rising out of their seats and following her. Their faces were twisted in fury and hate. Josephine was terrified and she dashed to the door, a pack of shrieking ghosts snapping at her heels. She felt skeletal hands grabbing at her, trying to stop her leaving. She twisted and turned, struggling to free herself from their grasp. Her coat was ripped off and her hat was snatched from her head, just as she managed to slip out the door. Screaming and crying, and almost out of her mind with fear, Josephine ran all the way home and told her parents what had happened. Later that day, someone came to the house holding what was left of Josephine's coat and hat. They had been found in the cemetery, torn to shreds. Number 2. High Beams. High Beams is a scary story about a young woman who goes out for drinks with her friends one night and decides to drive home on her own. A version of this story appeared in the book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. As the woman drove down a deserted highway, she noticed a lone pair of headlights quickly approaching her car from behind. When the car came closer, she noticed that it was going to overtake her. The car drew up beside her, but then the driver suddenly swerved back behind her car. She started getting nervous and kept an eye on the strange car in her rear-view mirror. He pulled up dangerously close to her rear bumper and began flashing his high beams at her. The headlights dimmed for a moment, but then the high beams flashed again and the car behind her surged forward. The car followed her very closely, and on tight curves, or over hills, he would flash his high beams on and off. The frightened woman struggled to keep her eyes on the road and fought the urge to keep looking at the car behind her. Finally, she approached her exit, but the car continued to follow, flashing the high beams again and again. The terrified woman took out her mobile phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, the woman screamed into the phone, "A car is following me. He keeps tailgating and blinking his lights at me." The woman gave her address, and in a few minutes she saw the red and blue lights of a police car in the distance. She breathed a sigh of relief as she pulled into her driveway, but suddenly the strange car pulled into the driveway behind her and began blinking its lights on and off like a maniac. The police car screeched to a halt on the woman's front lawn, and two police officers jumped out with their guns drawn. They pulled the man out of the strange car and forced him to lie face down on the lawn. Then they handcuffed him as he screamed, "There's someone in her car! There's someone in her car!" The two policemen suddenly pointed their guns in the woman's direction and fired. The woman screamed, but when she turned around, she saw the bloody corpse of a murderer fall out of her back seat. There was a large butcher knife still clasped in his cold, dead hand. The police searched her back seat and found duct tape, a blindfold, and a pair of handcuffs lying there. The woman realized that the man in the strange car had been trying to save her. When the police released him, he explained that, as he pulled up behind her car and his headlights lit up her back seat, he had seen a man with a butcher knife rising up behind her. Just as the madman was about to stab her, he flashed his high beams and the figure crouched back down. "I flashed my high beams every time I saw him raise the knife," he said. Number 1. The Babysitter. The Babysitter Story is a scary story based on an urban legend about a teenage girl who is babysitting two children one night when she receives a creepy phone call from a strange man. It is also known as The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. A version of this tale appeared in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There was a young girl who was in need of a job, was able to find work as a babysitter for a couple who lived in a large, isolated, old house. They were going out to see a movie that night and left the teenage babysitter in charge of their two young children. The babysitter put the children to bed when it got late and then went downstairs to watch some television. She was just getting comfortable when she heard the phone ringing. When she answered it, all she heard was heavy breathing, followed by a man's voice asking, "Have you checked on the children?" Freaked out, she hung up the phone, trying to convince herself that it was just someone playing a practical joke on her. She went back to watching television, but about 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. She picked up the receiver and heard hysterical laughter from the other end of the line. Then the same voice asked, "Why haven't you checked on the children?" The babysitter slammed down the phone. The poor girl was frightened out of her wits and immediately called the police. The operator at the police station told the babysitter that if the man called again, she should try to keep him talking. That would give the police time to trace the call. A few minutes later, the phone rang a third time, and when the babysitter answered it, she heard the heavy breathing again. The voice on the line said, "You should really check on the children." The babysitter listened to him laughing hysterically for a long time. She hung up the phone again, and almost immediately, it rang again. This time it was the operator from the police station who yelled, "Get out of the house right now. The calls are coming from the upstairs phone." The babysitter dropped the phone in shock, and suddenly she heard heavy footsteps walking down the stairs. Without pausing for a second, she ran out of the house as fast as her legs would carry her. Just as she closed the front door behind her, a man's hand slammed against the glass. She screamed and ran out into the street just as a police car was pulling up outside. The police searched the house and found the two children upstairs, hiding in a closet, crying uncontrollably. In the parents' bedroom, they found a bloody axe lying on the floor next to the upstairs phone. The back window was wide open and the curtains were blowing in the breeze. There was no sign of the madman who had made the phone calls. He had escaped into the night when the police arrived and managed to interrupt his horrible plan to kill the 2 children and the poor babysitter. Hi guys. Welcome to my channel. Hope you enjoyed. New video every week. Please like, share, and subscribe and turn on the bell notification button to receive the latest videos. Thank you.